My name is Vanessa Cole. I'm 34, and I'm the Regional Director of Clinical Operations for a senior living company that runs 12 facilities across 3 states. I know the difference between a $6,800 private room and a $6,800 invoice for a room that costs half that, the way most people know their own phone number. So when my parents told me they'd found the perfect place for my grandmother and asked me to help cover the difference, I should have asked one question before I said yes. What room number is she actually in? I didn't ask. I drove out to Cedarbrook Senior Living on a Tuesday afternoon, walked through the front doors, and found my 81-year-old grandmother in a shared room at the end of a hallway that smelled like bleach over something the bleach hadn't quite covered. 2 beds, a curtain on a track, a roommate's oxygen machine hissing on the other side. My mother looked up from the folding chair beside the bed, smiled, and said what she'd been building toward for 3 weeks. "We just need you to keep covering the difference, Vanessa. It's what the money's for." She thought she'd cornered me. She had no idea that the woman she'd been writing checks to for 2 years, the director of that facility, had been sending me monthly compliance reports since the day I was promoted. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where ordinary people face impossible family moments and walk out with their dignity intact. If you've ever been the one expected to pay, to fix, to stay quiet, this story is for you. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. But let me back up a few weeks before I walked into that room. Before the folding chair, before the oxygen machine, before my mother said the sentence that ended things. I need to tell you who I was the morning this started, because that's the version of me my parents were counting on, and it's not who I'd been for a long time. I started as a CNA at 19, working nights at a memory care unit outside Pittsburgh, learning how to turn a patient every 2 hours so they don't develop a pressure sore, how to read a chart faster than a family member can finish a sentence, how to tell the difference between a resident who's confused and a resident who's in pain and can't say so. I got my LPN at 22, my RN at 26, going to school during the day and working the floor at night, running on protein bars and the particular exhaustion that comes from holding someone's hand while they die on a shift that started 12 hours earlier. Assistant Director of Nursing by 29. Regional Director of Clinical Operations by 33. I don't own the company. I oversee the clinical side of 12 buildings, 400 and some beds, staffing ratios, care plans, state surveys, incident reports. When a facility fails a CMS inspection, my phone rings before the ink is dry on the citation. I'm not rich. I drive a Subaru with 90,000 miles on it, and I split my rent with nobody because I like coming home to quiet. My one indulgence is a coffee subscription that costs more than it should. My staff thinks that's funny. It's not really about the coffee. When you spend your 20s watching what happens to people nobody checks on, you learn to keep close track of the people you love. That Tuesday morning, I was in my office reviewing a staffing variance report for a facility in Erie. The kind of morning that makes you forget not everyone spends their day thinking in ratios and citations. My phone buzzed. My mother, calling instead of texting, which was already unusual. She told me they'd found a place for Grandma Ruth. "A really nice place," she said. "Private room, beautiful grounds, $6,800 a month. And don't worry, we've got most of it covered. We just need a little help bridging the gap until her house sells." I asked which facility. "Cedarbrook," she said. "Out past Route 9. I told her I'd never audited that one, which was true. It wasn't in my company's network. And I didn't think anything else of it in that moment. I said I'd help. I always said I'd help. That's the part I need you to understand before anything else happens in this story. My family has a phrase. My mother says it, my father repeats it. My younger brother Danny has said it exactly twice in his life, and both times it worked. That's what the money's for. She said it when I was 24 and Danny needed help with a car payment. She said it when Dad's roof needed replacing, and somehow my savings account covered the deductible. She said it 3 years ago, when Grandma Ruth first started needing more care than she could manage alone in her house, and my parents told me they'd handle finding a place, and all they needed from me was a monthly transfer. That's what the money's for, Vanessa. You make good money now. It's not like it's hurting you. I want to be clear that I didn't resent helping my grandmother. Ruth raised me for 2 summers when my parents were going through a bad stretch. She taught me to can tomatoes and to never let a man raise his voice at me twice. I would have paid for her care with both hands. What I resented, what I didn't let myself look at directly until 3 weeks ago, was that the money never seemed to go where they said it went. I want to pause here and ask you something, because I think some of you already know where this is going. Have you ever paid for something you never got to see? Not because you were kept from seeing it, but because nobody ever quite got around to inviting you? Drop a comment if that sounds familiar. I read every one of them. For 2 years, I sent $2,400 a month to my parents' joint account. The number they told me was the gap between Ruth's Social Security, her small pension, and the $6,800 sticker price of her room. I never once asked to see the invoice. That's the part that sits heaviest with me now. I audit other families' invoices for a living. I know exactly what a memory care line item should look like, what a private pay room differential runs in that market, what Medicaid spend-down paperwork is supposed to trigger once a resident's assets fall below a certain threshold. And I never once asked my own mother for a single piece of paper. I trusted her the way you trust a smoke detector you've never tested. I just assumed it would work if the moment came. The moment came on a Sunday. My father called, and his voice had the careful, over-rehearsed calm he uses right before he asks for something. Vanessa, we need to talk about Ruth's finances. Her house still hasn't sold. The market's soft. We need you to bump up the monthly transfer, maybe by another $1,200, just until it closes. I asked why the number kept moving. He said Cedarbrook had raised their rates. I said I'd call and confirm, professional habit, the same way I'd call any facility that adjusted a rate without documentation. My father went quiet in a way that should have told me everything right there. Don't do that, he said. It'll just complicate things with the office. Just send the number, Vanessa. That's what the money's for. I sent the money. I want to be honest about that, because this isn't a story about a woman who caught on immediately and drew a hard line. I sent it because some reflex in me, the one built over 30 years of being the daughter who fixes things, fired before my brain caught up. But that night I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, and I did something I do every single day at work and had never once done for my own family. I pulled a facility. Cedarbrook Senior Living, license number on file with the state, last survey 11 months ago. 4 cited deficiencies, one of them tagged for inadequate staffing on the overnight shift. I looked up their published private pay rates for a semi-private room, the kind with 2 beds and a curtain. $3,800 a month, not $6,800. I looked up the private single occupancy rate, $5,200, still not $6,800. There was no room type at that building that priced at $6,800 a month, not with the amenity package, not with the highest tier of care add-ons. I sat with that number for a long time, the way you sit with a chart that doesn't add up, checking your own math before you trust the discrepancy is real. Here's what I want you to understand about my industry, because it matters for what happened next. Somebody has to be listed as the point of contact on every resident's financial file. Somebody signs the admission agreement, authorizes the billing, receives the monthly statement. I am not naive enough to think my grandmother, at 81 with early-stage dementia, was the one authorizing anything. Which meant somebody in my family had a copy of an invoice I had never once been shown. And that same somebody had been asking me for money on top of a number I now had real reason to believe was inflated by close to $2,500 a month. Money that had been flowing out of my account for 2 years. I didn't call my mother and demand answers. I've learned, both at work and now in my own family, that the person who confronts first with only suspicion loses the room. I did what I do with every facility I oversee. I requested documentation. I told my mother, casually, over a text, that my accountant needed a copy of Ruth's care agreement for a tax deduction I was trying to claim on the caregiving expenses. It was a lie, but it was a small, precise one, the kind that gets you exactly the document you need without announcing what you already suspect. My mother sent a photo of the agreement 2 days later, and there, on page 3, under monthly rate, was the number $6,800. Signed by my mother, dated 2 years ago, for a room designation that read, Private Suite B. I called Cedarbrook the next morning, not as Vanessa Cole, the granddaughter, but the way I call any facility, professionally, asking to speak to the director about a resident's care plan review. Standard language nobody questions when you know how to say it. A woman named Priya Anand picked up. Director of Cedarbrook, she told me, going on 4 years. I asked, carefully, generally, about their private suite pricing. She told me their highest tier, the suite package with private bath and enhanced amenities, ran $4,950 a month, not $6,800. I asked if there was any circumstance where a family might be billed above the posted rate. She paused just slightly before she answered, the pause of someone choosing her next sentence with real care. She said, only if a third party is managing the billing directly and adding their own administrative markup. We don't control that. We just get our number. I asked whose name was on Ruth Cole's account as the financial power of attorney. She said she'd have to check the file and call me back. She asked for my name. I told her, Vanessa Cole. There was a silence on the line I will never forget, the specific silence of someone recalculating everything they thought they knew about a call in real time. She said, Vanessa Cole, from Horizon Point Senior Living? I said yes. She said, you're my regional clinical director. I've been sending you my compliance packets for 3 years. I sat in my car in a parking lot I hadn't even noticed I'd pulled into, and I laughed. Not because anything was funny, but because the universe had apparently decided I needed the two halves of my life to collide at the worst possible moment. Cedarbrook wasn't in my network, but 4 months earlier, Horizon Point had acquired the small regional group that owned it. The paperwork had gone through my office. I had literally signed off on the acquisition packet that made Priya Anand's facility and every resident inside it part of my responsibility. I had been paying an inflated bill to house my own grandmother in a building where the director technically answered to me, and I hadn't known any of it, because I'd never once asked to see where the money actually went. Priya and I talked for 40 minutes that afternoon, not as director and regional supervisor, as two women who had both just realized something ugly was sitting quietly in plain sight. She pulled Ruth's full financial file while we were on the phone. The financial power of attorney on record wasn't my mother, it was my father, Gerald Cole, who had signed a third-party billing authorization the same week Ruth was admitted, routing all invoices through a private email address instead of directly to the family. Priya read me the actual invoice history, the real one, the one the facility generated every month. $4,950 for the private suite, not $6,800. My parents had been billing me for a number that existed nowhere in Cedarbrook's system. I want to stop here and tell you something else, because this is the part that made my stomach turn in a way the money never did. I asked Priya what room Ruth was actually in, not what the file said, what room, physically, today. She checked. Ruth Cole had been moved 8 months ago, out of the private suite and into a shared, semi-private room, the $3,800 tier, the one with the curtain and the roommate and the oxygen machine. Nobody had told me. My mother had kept sending me a bill for a private suite my grandmother hadn't lived in for 8 months and had been quietly pocketing the difference between what I paid and what the facility actually charged for a shared room. A gap of nearly $3,000 a month for 8 months on top of whatever they'd been skimming before that from the sweet differential itself. I don't cry easily. I've delivered end-of-life conversations to families in facility conference rooms more times than I can count, and I've learned to keep my voice steady when the ground under someone else is shaking. But I sat in that parking lot, and I cried for about 4 minutes. Not for the money, for my grandmother, who had been moved out of the nicer room and never told me, who had likely noticed the downgrade herself and said nothing because that's what Ruth does. She doesn't complain. She just adjusts and waits for someone to notice. Nobody had noticed. I hadn't noticed, because I've been too busy being useful from 200 miles away to ever drive out and see the room with my own eyes. Priya asked me what I wanted to do. I told her I needed a few days. I needed to see it myself first, before anyone knew what I knew. I drove out to Cedarbrook the following Tuesday. I told my mother I wanted to visit Grandma Ruth, which was true, and I didn't mention that I'd already spoken to the director, which was also true, technically, since I hadn't told her the content of that call. My mother met me there, which surprised me. I think, looking back, she wanted to manage the visit, make sure I saw exactly what she wanted me to see, and nothing else. She walked me down the hallway that smelled like bleach over something the bleach hadn't quite covered, and she opened the door to room 114, and there was my grandmother, in a bed by the window, a curtain dividing her side from a roommate's, an oxygen concentrator hissing softly from the other bed. Ruth's face lit up when she saw me. She always lights up. That's the cruelest part of dementia, how the love stays sharper than the memory. My mother settled into the folding chair beside the bed, the posture of someone who had done this enough times to have a favorite chair, and she smiled at me, the particular smile she uses when she's about to ask for something and wants me pre-softened. "Vanessa," she said, "we just need you to keep covering the difference. It's what the money's for." I looked at the room. I looked at the curtain. I looked at my grandmother's hand, resting on top of a blanket that wasn't the one I remembered from her house. I asked my mother, casually, the way I'd ask any family during a care plan review, how long Ruth had been in this room. My mother said, "Oh, a few months. They had some availability issues. It's temporary." I asked if she was aware the facility's semi-private rate was $3,800, not $6,800. My mother's face did something I'd never seen it do before. A small, controlled flicker. The exact same flicker I've watched on the faces of administrators who are about to be cited for a deficiency they thought nobody would catch. She said, "Well, there's other costs, Vanessa. Incidentals, the enhanced care package. You wouldn't understand all of it. You're not the one managing this day to day." I told her I actually was uniquely positioned to understand all of it, because Cedarbrook had been part of my company's network for 4 months, and I'd spoken to the director on Thursday, and I had the real invoice history in an email in my inbox right now, and I would like her to explain, specifically, where the other $2,900 a month had been going for the past 8 months, while my grandmother lived in a shared room I paid private suite rates for. My father, who had come in a few minutes behind us carrying a bag from the pharmacy, stopped in the doorway. He didn't say anything. My mother's jaw tightened, the tell I'd cataloged since I was small, the same one she gets right before she pivots to being the wronged party instead of the one who did the wronging. She said, "Do you have any idea what it costs to raise 2 children and now take care of an elderly parent? We have needs too, Vanessa. You make good money. It's not like it's hurting you." There it was. Not an apology, not even a denial. A justification, delivered with the same tone she'd used my whole life to explain why my savings account belonged to everyone but me. I asked her the only question I actually needed answered. "Did you know she'd been moved out of the suite 8 months ago and you never told me?" My mother didn't answer that one directly. She said something about how the suite wasn't necessary. Ruth doesn't really notice the difference anymore, does she? And I felt something in my chest go very still and very cold, the particular calm I get right before I walk into a facility that's about to be cited for something serious, and I know exactly what I'm going to find, and I know exactly what I'm going to do about it. I want to tell you about Priya Anand for a second, because she's the person in this story who never asked me for anything and gave me everything I needed anyway. She'd been quietly documenting every red flag on that account for months before I ever called, not because she suspected fraud specifically, but because good directors notice patterns. A family that routes billing through a private email instead of the facility portal. A resident moved to a lower tier of care whose invoice never adjusted downward. A financial power of attorney who never once showed up for a quarterly care conference. She'd flagged the account internally twice, and both times it had gotten lost in the acquisition transition, because the compliance chain that was supposed to catch it led, eventually, to me, and I hadn't known to look. I called Priya from the parking lot after that visit, my hands steady in the specific way they get when I'm about to do my job instead of feeling my feelings. And I asked her to pull the full billing history, every invoice, every payment, every dollar, and email it to me before end of day. She said it was already in my inbox. She'd sent it the moment we hung up on Thursday. She'd been waiting for me to be ready to open it. I sat back down at that table with my mother, my father now standing behind her chair with his hand on her shoulder, and I opened my laptop right there in room 114, and I turned the screen to face them, the way I turn a deficiency report to face an administrator who's about to be cited. 2 years of invoices, 2 years of what Cedarbrook actually charged, laid out beside 2 years of what they told me to pay. The gap totaled just under $54,000, not evaporated into thin air, deposited, month after month, into the joint account my parents shared. The same account they'd told me, 3 weeks ago, needed another $1,200 because the house still hadn't sold. My mother looked at the screen for a long time. Then she said, quieter than I expected, "We were going to pay it back once the house sells." I asked her why it needed to be borrowed from a bill for her own mother's care in the first place, rather than simply asked for directly, the way any adult asks another adult for a loan. She didn't have an answer for that. My father, still standing, finally spoke. He said, "We didn't think you'd say yes if we just asked." And that, more than the money, more than the curtain, more than the roommate's oxygen machine, was the sentence that told me everything I needed to know about how my family had always seen me. Not as a daughter to be honest with, as a number to be managed. I didn't raise my voice. I've learned, both at work and now in my own family, that the person who stays calm controls the room. I told my mother I'd be handling Ruth's account directly from that point forward, that the facility would be updating the financial power of attorney immediately, and that I would personally be reviewing her care plan with Priya every month going forward. My mother started to argue that I couldn't just take over, that she was still Ruth's daughter, and I told her, evenly, that being her daughter hadn't stopped her from billing her own mother's granddaughter for a room Ruth hadn't slept in for 8 months, so I wasn't especially interested in her opinion of what I could and couldn't do. Here's a question for you, and I'd genuinely like to know. If you found out someone you loved had been quietly billing you for something that didn't exist, would you have confronted them the moment you suspected? Or would you have waited, the way I did, until you had every document lined up? I've thought about this a lot since it happened. Tell me in the comments. And if this story is landing for you, go ahead and hit subscribe, because what happened over the following month is the part that actually changed things for my grandmother, not just for me. I moved Ruth into a private suite the following week. The real one, the one that actually costs $4,950 a month, the number I now pay directly to the facility through a portal that generates an automatic statement to my email. No intermediary, no private account, no room for anyone to stand between me and the truth of what my money buys. Priya personally walked me through the new room, the actual amenities, the actual staffing ratio on that hall, And for the first time in 2 years, I could tell you exactly what my grandmother's care looked like on any given day, because I'd finally done for my own family what I do for every family whose facility I oversee. I asked to see it myself. I didn't sue my parents. I want to be honest about that, because some of you are going to want a dramatic ending where lawyers get involved and someone goes to jail. And that's not what happened here, and I think that matters. What I did instead was simpler and, I think, more permanent. I told them the money stops, not the help. I still want to help Ruth, but every dollar goes directly to the facility from now on, transparent, documented, reviewable by anyone who asks, and if they ever need help with their own expenses, they can ask me directly, honestly, the way you ask another adult, instead of routing it through a bill for a woman who can't advocate for herself anymore. My mother didn't speak to me for 3 weeks after that visit. When she finally called, she didn't apologize, not really. She said she felt like I'd humiliated her in front of my father, which told me she still hadn't understood what the actual problem was. My father called separately, a few days later, and said, quieter than I'd heard him in years, that he was sorry, that it started small, covering a gap here and there, and it just kept growing because I never asked questions, and it got easier every month I didn't. I told him I appreciated him saying that. I also told him it didn't change what happens going forward. Priya and I still talk every month, now as colleagues who happen to share one very complicated resident. Ruth is doing well in the new room. She has a window that actually gets afternoon light, and a roommate she's genuinely fond of down the hall she visits for cards on Thursdays, and a granddaughter who now drives out every second Sunday instead of trusting a monthly transfer to stand in for actually showing up. Here's what I learned, and I think it's the only piece of this worth carrying with you. You can build an entire career making sure strangers get honest, documented, transparent care, and still let the people closest to you skip every one of those steps, simply because asking felt like an accusation you weren't ready to make. Love is not a wire transfer you never audit. If you're paying for something, you're allowed to see it. You're allowed to ask. And if someone in your life would rather you not look too closely at where the money goes, that unwillingness is the answer, whether or not they ever say it out loud. That's my story. One shared room, one billing history, and a director who turned out to already work for me. If you've ever been the family bank, hear me. Helping is a choice, and it doesn't have to come with your eyes closed. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.